Yep. Thank you, Jesus, I am free. Hey, I'm wondering today, because of that freedom that Jesus provided us, we live on this side of Easter, right? How many of you lived in that kind of freedom this last week? When we talked about living. Am I there? Can you hear me now? There we go. Well, you know, I love Easter. What pastor doesn't? What Christian doesn't, really, when it comes right down to it? And we started in our series of the Beatitudes, and right before we hit What If on Palm Sunday, we did Blessed Are the Peacemakers from the Beatitudes. Well, when it comes right down to it, Jesus is the ultimate peacemaker, and we discovered that with Palm Sunday and Easter. So I thought it would be great if we would bookend Easter with being a peacemaker. And today we're going to revisit that topic of being a peacemaker. And I kind of have called this one being a peacemaker either revisited or extended. I don't care how you look at it, but that's what we're going to talk about today, being a peacemaker. And the passage that we come from is Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And just as a recap for the one before we hit Easter, peacemakers actively seek to resolve conflict, right? And some misconceptions about what peacemaking is. Number one, it is not avoidance. And number two, it is not appeasement. And number three, we don't go right to the other end of the spectrum. It is also not aggression, okay? And what's the problem with unresolved conflict? Well, number one, it hinders our fellowship with God, right? And number two, it hinders our prayers. So the question is, how can we be a peacemaker? And you might remember, we introduced the peace plan. P being plan a peace conference. That is, take the initiative, take the first step. E, empathize with others, put ourselves in their place, walk a mile in their shoes. A, attack the problem, not the person. Don't get that mixed up, okay? Kind of shoot yourself in the foot right when you're starting out, right? We can't fix the problem if we're fixing the blame at the same time, if we're blaming the other person. C, cooperate as much as possible. We need to build bridges. We shouldn't burn them. And what is it that we can do together to make things right where they are wrong? Romans 12:18 tells us if it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do you practice what the Bible says? You know, peace has a price. You remember when we talked about that? If we want peace in our homes, if we want peace in our marriage, it's going to cost us our egos, it's going to cost us our pride, it's going to cost us our self-centeredness and our selfishness. Peacemakers plant seeds of peace, and we've got to cooperate. And then the final E in the peace plan is emphasize reconciliation, not resolution. They are different. To reconcile means to reestablish a relationship. What it doesn't necessarily mean is that we resolved all of our problems. We see things lockstep, eye to eye. There will always be differences. Kim and I have been married for over 30 years, and believe it or not, we have our differences. But anyway, we can walk arm in arm without having to see eye to eye, 100%. That was all from 3:17. But I'd like us to take a deeper dive. Why? Jesus did. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus takes a deeper dive on this being a peacemaker. He expanded the meaning of peacemaker later in Matthew 5, which helps us to understand what it means to bring peace into our relationships. And I want to start with Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 42. It's called, in my NIV Bible, it was called an eye for an eye. You've heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Now, doesn't that sound unnatural? Not the path we would normally want to take. We would want to retaliate. We would want to get even. We would want to seek revenge. Actually, we probably would want just a little more than that. Because isn't it in our nature to just go slightly up on the other person or the other team? I mean, we're in the midst of, when it comes to basketball or football or virtually any team sport, there's trades. And after the trade, everybody's got to evaluate the trade. Who got the better end of the stick? Well, don't we always want to get the better end of the stick? I think we do. But clearly, seeking, or looking for revenge or getting even isn't condoned in the Bible. A dejected woman was walking along the beach when she saw a bottle in the sand, and she picked it up and pulled out the cork, and whoosh, a big puff of smoke appeared. You have released me from my prison, the genie told her. To show my thanks, I grant you 3 wishes, but take care, for with each wish, your mate will receive double whatever you request. Why, the woman asked. That bum left me for another woman. That is how it is written, replied the genie. The woman shrugged and then asked for $1 million. Flash, there was a flash of light, and $1 million appeared right at her feet. And at the same instant, in a far-off place, her wayward husband looked down and to see twice that amount at his feet. And your second wish, genie? Genie, I want the world's most expensive diamond necklace. Another flash of light, and the woman was holding a very precious treasure in her hands. And in that distant place, her husband was looking for a gem broker to buy his latest bonanza. Genie, is it really true that my husband has $2 million and more jewels than I do, and that he gets double whatever I wish for? The genie said that it was indeed true. Okay, genie, I'm ready with my last wish. The woman said, scare me half to death. Okay, it's not cloudy. We should have picked up on that just a little faster than that. Okay, revenge is something I think we can easily understand. It's getting back at someone for the wrong that we perceive they have committed against us. A child knocks another one down on the playground. The victim gets up and knocks down their bully. Vengeance served. We get poor service at a store, cut off in traffic, gossiped about by a coworker, and we lash back at the offending party in an effort to even the score. Vengeance served. And yet, it's never condoned in the Bible. In some measure, at least, probably because we're not a good judge of what getting even is, things really often will spiral out of control. Leviticus 19:18 says, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. But the leaders of Jesus' day, and many folks since, had found a way to justify revenge through the idea of an eye for an eye. And the principle comes from the Old Testament. It was a law laid down by God through Moses, and it served Israel up to the time of Jesus. It was never meant to justify revenge, however. Instead, it was to ensure justice for everyone, justice for all. And each time the phrase eye for eye or tooth for tooth comes up in the law, it is associated with someone who had caused harm to another. In Exodus 21:22-25, it protected the rights of a pregnant woman who was harmed by men, and by extension was meant to protect the woman's right to safety. In Leviticus 24, verses 17-22, if you were found guilty of killing someone, you would lose your life as well. And this also applied to those who injured others or their property. In Deuteronomy 19:16-21, it applied to promises, covenants, and oaths that were made. And if you falsely accuse someone of stealing livestock, then the liar is the one who received the punishment for stealing livestock. The principle of eye for eye had 2 effects. 1, it ensured that the guilty party would then be held accountable for their crime. And secondly, it also protected them from vendettas and vigilante justice. Being held accountable ensured that the guilty party didn't get away with the crime without facing judgment appropriate to the offense. Ever since people have walked the face of the earth, they have tried to get away with crimes without facing the consequences. It's why Adam and Eve tried to hide when you think about it, in the Garden of Eden. This principle was meant to show all Israel and those who lived among them that God desires equal justice for all, regardless of your status or station in life. An eye for eye also protects the offender from the disproportionate hostility of those whom they have victimized. In some societies, it is acceptable for the family of the victim to go after the accused and give out whatever form of punishment they see fit. Now, that's not particularly good, as people have so often proven to be very poor judges of what is acceptable, what is a just consequence for a criminal act. Sadly, in some parts of the world, if you get caught stealing a piece of bread or perhaps an apple, they're going to remove your hand. Some societies give members of a particular race longer sentences for similar crimes committed. That's not equal. That's not just. And in some areas of the world, they will execute a woman caught in adultery while patting the man she was with on the back. Hardly justice. So, God laid down this simple principle of eye for eye or tooth for tooth. But once man got a hold of it, they found a way to pervert its intention anyway and ended up using it as a vehicle for revenge. In this passage, Jesus is teaching, not only he tells us to stop seeking revenge, but that we are to bypass our right to compensation that eye for eye provided. He gives us 3 examples to explain what he means to further the teaching. With each one, Jesus is reflecting a different perspective on how a victim should react to an attack on them. Number 1, turn the other cheek. When someone struck another, they most often used their right hand. To strike the right cheek with the right hand required them to use the back of their hand. That type of strike was considered very humiliating for the victim. This is the way prisoners were hit by jailers or slaves were struck by their owners. Turning the left cheek to the offender seems to be asking for more of the same, but in fact it challenges the relationship between the two. The victim may still be weaker, and they might still be in the wrong, but to be struck on the left cheek now requires the offender to use the front of their hand or fist. Now, in Jesus' time, this was how someone struck out at a person of equal status. In turning the cheek, the victim causes the offender to then recognize them as a person, not like a dog to be beaten or whipped. Number 2, handling over your coat or your cloak. We see this in verse 40. When we dress, we put on the first layer of clothing, shirts, pants, socks, that sort of thing. Then in verse 20, the coat is the equivalent of a tunic. When we go outside, we often add another layer of clothing, maybe a sweater, sweatshirt, jacket, rain gear. That'd be the same as the coat or the cloak. Now, in those days, a man could be sued for his tunic, but the law drew the line at a man's coat or cloak, the garment worn over the tunic. This allowed the guy to still have something to wear, not only for his dignity, but also for his survival. And the principle here isn't that Jesus wanted folks to walk around in next to nothing, but to return even more than what we have to do, more than what was the absolute minimum. When we are indebted to others, Jesus is calling us to be people who actively make restitution for our debts and then go even a little further. All right? Here Jesus is teaching us that instead of being an unsuccessful defendant, they are now seeking the best they can to give to the other person. They go from trying to avoid responsibility to making a personal sacrifice on their behalf. And then, if the accused isn't guilty of the offense, this effect gets even more amplified or magnified, if you will. When Christians are trapped, perhaps by unfair treatment, they can yell and fight like everyone else, right? I mean, that's kind of what we want to do. But they can also turn the tables by moving into a relationship in which they are actually rendering assistance to those who would hurt them. Now, that's easy to say, but really hard to do, especially for the ones that are being treated unfairly. It's a lot easier to kick, yell, and scream that things aren't fair, right? But don't we usually associate kick, yelling, and screaming with children, right? Now, this isn't one of those places where we talk about being children of God necessarily, but when we're acting like children, right? There will always be situations where we are treated unfairly. And Jesus shows us how to make something good out of it. I know this isn't a new revelation, but I'm going to state it anyway. Life isn't fair. Life isn't fair. But we always have a choice with regard to how we're going to react to unfairness or injustice. Number 3, how about walking the extra mile in verse 41? In Jesus' day, a Roman soldier had the right to force a civilian to carry the soldier's pack or belongings 1 Roman mile. Well, how far was that? A Roman mile was 1,000 paces of about 3¼ feet each, or about 1.5 Soldiers were given this perk so that they wouldn't get worn out traveling with the gear, carrying their gear all the time, but they were limited to just 1 mile per civilian so that they wouldn't be abusive. But still, being forced to carry the gear was going to be a humiliating experience. And most likely, those forced to do so felt some ill will towards the guy that made him do it. Jesus is teaching his listeners that in this kind of situation, there's an opportunity to actually do a good deed. Okay? When someone decides to go the extra mile, they're using their freedom to choose, and again, the relationship between the two people involved changes, right? The taskmaster now becomes the object of the victim's will. He still benefits from the other's effort, But the victim is no longer a victim. They're making a choice. The extra mile concept goes well beyond luggage or packs. We all have relationships in which we're expected to do certain things. Jesus is telling us that we have the ability to turn an obligation instead into an opportunity. We can take a chore and turn it into voluntary service rendered if we're willing to go that extra mile. Now, following these three examples, Jesus tells us not to hesitate to help those who ask and to give to those in need. I said need, not want. There's a qualification there. Too many wants are now perceived as needs, all right? Now, what relationship does giving and borrowing have with being hit, being sued, or being put to work unfairly? Well, there's a progression here. Jesus has walked his listeners through being assaulted, through being sued, through being inconvenienced, and now being borrowed and begged from. So in a sense, they're all attacks. Being hit with a fist or a lawsuit both sting in different ways, and nobody likes to be inconvenienced or put to work unfairly. And we usually don't like people asking us for money, either as a gift or as a loan. But the point is, any of these situations can lead or bring us into a spirit in which we actively seek the worst for the other person. We want to hit back. We want to countersue. We want to make the other party work harder. We want to make their life, let's be honest, we'd rather make their life a little bit more miserable like they did to us, right? And tell the beggar, why don't you go get a job? Or the borrower to put their hands into somebody else's pocket. But here Jesus is illustrating, he's telling us to do something different. When we're in situations seeking revenge toward a person intruding on our life, we are to react in the way that makes things better, not worse. Now Jesus further extends his teaching again later in Matthew, just following this, in Matthew 5:43-48, in the section, Love Your Enemies. Let's follow along. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get for that? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that. Be perfect. Therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Now, of course, this is a very well-known teaching of Jesus that we should not hate, but rather love our enemies. Again, Jesus starts off with a commonly held assumption that God wants us to love those around us. Nobody here is going to debate that, right? Our neighbors. But hate our enemies. And here again, he is dealing with a concept that has become perverted by society at large. Yes, the Bible teaches us to love our neighbor. Again, we read in Leviticus 19:18, don't seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And remember, Jesus himself said the greatest commandments were to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. Nowhere in Scripture does it say to hate your enemies. Nowhere. That was something that was added to the command by who else? The Pharisees, the church leaders of the day. They believed that the people's hatred of their enemies was God's way of judging those who opposed them. And in so doing, they justified their hatred toward their opponents by saying it was God judging evil through them. Now, just in case we look down our nose at those guys, we still do this today. We take something we don't like and then justify our hate or dislike for it by saying, God hates it too. God hates it too. It's not the first time that people have tried to sit in God's judgment seat or use God's judgment as an excuse for their own prejudices. For example, we have white supremacist groups that somehow use God to justify their racism. Somehow. And incorporate Christian rituals into their vulgar practices. We just celebrated Easter. White supremacy groups abuse the cross. Absolutely abusive. Totally out of line. They burn them, right? Anyway, there was once a pamphlet distributed claiming that rock music was based on African drum beats, which were used to summon evil spirits. Inference being, we should stay away from all forms of evil music. In this one document, these folks managed to transform their personal distaste for one style of music into a condemnation from God and a side slap to those of African ancestry. Not a good look for anyone, let alone Christians, gang. Not at all. I mean, especially when you think about, we were just talking in CE this morning about the different nationalities or races involved in the group of disciples. And guess what? They didn't all look like us. Okay. God doesn't call for us to hate our enemies, and he never asks us to use his name to justify our own personal prejudices. Never. Contrary to this practice, Jesus just comes right out and says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Jesus calls us to stop hating those who are against us and to start loving them. When we do, we are behaving like his children in a good way, imitating the love that God has for all of mankind. And then just to be sure we get the point, he gives us 3 situations to think about this one too, okay? Number 1, the sun and the rain in verse 45. Jesus shares that God causes it to rain on all regardless of whether or not they love him. Those who love God will get sunny times, snow flurries, rainstorms, and hurricanes. And so too will those who hate him. And that can be applied to virtually any area of life, like financial, intellectual, physical, any AL you want. In all things, there will be easier times and times of hardship. Now, if God is willing to allow everybody equal treatment and opportunity, who are we supposed to be like? We're supposed to be like Jesus. We're supposed to be imitators of God to the best of our ability. So if that's the way God is, if that's the way Jesus was, we're supposed to imitate him and do the same. That is Jesus' point in this section. Okay? Secondly, love and rewards. Jesus makes 2 comparisons that are meant to get at the self-righteous attitudes of the leaders of the day. The first one takes on our inclination to show love to those who love us back. That's not so hard to do. It's a natural reaction to love those who show us love. And it's how we're made, right? Love is most often a reciprocal thing. So when someone shows us love in some way, we should be inclined to show it back. But the leaders were so proud of themselves because they did so many good deeds, yet these deeds were usually done for those who showed them the respect and admiration that they so desperately coveted and desired. They boasted of these good deeds. The more the better, they thought and they taught. But Jesus, like always, he takes their pride and he compares them to the class of people that they would have despised the most, tax collectors. So if you're a tax collector here today, I apologize, but you're almost universally despised by all of culture, okay? But I just want you to know I love you anyway because Jesus tells me I have to. But anyway, in so doing, Jesus is saying that you can be as nice to your friends as you like. But this doesn't really make you any better than those who despise, yet you despise the most. Tax collectors were a really good example to use because everyone hated them. The class of tax collector that he's speaking of were the local folks. That is, one of their own, their former friends and neighbors that had agreed to help the Romans collect the taxes. So they were considered traitors by those that they were collecting the taxes from, and they were also despised because of the contact that they had with the outsiders. Now, Jesus couldn't have picked a group of people who the leaders would have hated any more than those, and to be compared to them would have been absolutely intolerable in their mind. It probably almost made them sick. But Jesus was right. Showing love to those who love us is a good thing, but it really doesn't make you any better than anybody else. Jesus knew that the real test of love was to show it to those who won't reciprocate or show it back to us. That is a test, and one that shows us how to pass. Jesus spent 30 years living among those who didn't always show him the love he deserved. And then he gave his very life for each and every one of us, and regardless of how we felt about him at the time. Perhaps you can remember with me the words he said as the hammer hit the spikes. It's pretty fresh in our minds with Easter just happening. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. Jesus passed the test of loving those who did not love him. And in so doing, he left us an example to follow. And thirdly, a simple greeting in verse 47. And of course, showing love for someone doesn't always mean that we need to show our undying devotion, right? It can be something as simple as saying hi or hello as you pass by someone on the street or in the hall. And I think that's what Jesus is getting at here in his last example. A greeting is a sign of acknowledgement. I see you, right? An acknowledgement. There we go. When someone says hello, when they say hello to you, they're showing that at least they care enough to see you as a person. And very often, that's going to be enough. We don't need to be engulfed or gushing with affection every time someone passes us by. If that were the case, we'd probably all end up hiding in our homes for fear of being smothered with too much affection, okay? Especially for those that don't care to be touched all that much. But more seriously, as God's people, do you think we should get brownie points for greeting each other with a warm hello? Of course not. You don't have to be a Christian to say, hi, how are you? Nearly everybody does that, and that's the point that Jesus makes. Giving a friend a warm handshake is good, but it's really no better than what anybody else would do. If you want to know what love is, show some of that love to someone who can't stand you, or vice versa. You don't really care much for them either, right? With a simple hello. That is the starting point. And that starting point works on all kinds of man-made barriers. How do we begin to bridge the gaps that have formed between cultures living in the same region? We start with hello. For example, Catholics and Protestants in many areas are drawing closer and closer as we strive to bring peace where there has been division and misunderstanding. Where did this reconciliation begin? With hello. Now, hello is only going to get you so far. It's not magic, but it's where we start. Then we find something in this sermon that scares the living daylights out of most of us. Be perfect. Only one guy ever managed that, and we crucified him, right? After sharing his example of loving those who oppose us, Jesus ends the whole chapter with the words that just don't seem fair. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. That tends to make me want to say, Jesus, that's really easy for you to say, but you had a head start on the rest of us there. I mean, after trying to get us to love those who may not love us back, you would think that he would come up with something easier than that. But he's not calling us this to bring us down. He's not calling us to this to bring us down. He spent this whole chapter encouraging and commanding us to be distinct from those around us. And the leaders of the day had the appearance of perfection down to an art. Notice I said the appearance. They were anything but perfect, right? They dressed right. They acted right. They thought they were always right. But inside, they were more lost than the very prostitutes and tax collectors they despised so very much. Jesus just finished a set of commandments which was boiled down to one thing, and that is be the real thing. Being perfect is the sum of this calling. If Jesus called us to anything less, we'd eventually get there, potentially. And then we would look around and say, I've made it. I can put my feet up. I don't have any place to go. I don't have to do any more growing, right? When we do this, then we're no better than the hypocrites. Jesus warned us not to imitate. We end up comparing ourselves with others and saying, hey, not bad at all. And our achievements become the conceit that begins our downfall. And that's a problem. Why? Because pride goes before a fall. But when we strive for perfection, we know that we're not going to make it on our own. We will or should, however, grow and continue to grow. We'll grow in love and compassion and mercy and all the other things Jesus calls us to grow in this chapter. And every time we grow, we'll be closer to being just like his son, Jesus. It is reward for a life lived for him, and it is a reality that we'll enjoy in heaven with him. There are lots of ways to show love for others and our opposition. And it doesn't mean we'll always have to jump in front of bullets or get knocked around. Okay? A man shared, our family really loves baseball. All 3 of our children played, beginning with t-ball. The baby of our family, Rudy, started playing ball in the front yard with his dad at the age of 2. So by the time he was 4, Rudy was more than ready to play. I remember one game when Rudy was 6. He was on the pitcher's mound. His team was winning, and Rudy was thrilled. He was really serious about the game. There was a child on the other team who had Down syndrome. He came up to bat, and because he was speed challenged, he always batted last. Each time, the boys struggled to get to first base. Rudy would watch his teammates easily get him out. At the boys' last at-bat, he hit the ball straight to Rudy on the mound. Rudy reached down to get it, and then it was like a light went on in his mind, in his head. He bobbled the ball, and he kicked it around with his feet. And the boy ran for all he was worth down to first base, headed down, his arms pumping just as fast as he could make it. I stood there watching my son fumble with the ball. My friend Lisa, whose son played on the same team, noticed what was happening too. The boy ran to second. Rudy continued to act like probably like a Keystone Cops type of thing when you think about it, continued to fumble around and saw what was happening. And couldn't get a hand on the ball as the boy made it to third. We stood there crying as Rudy showed us that there are more important things in life than making it out. He was exhibiting compassion in the purest sense. Rudy's teammates were screaming at him, but eventually they began to follow his lead. Did you hear that? They began to follow his lead. Remember how we just start with hello? Sometimes a simple act of kindness is all it takes for people to start following that lead. So if we had more examples of this, perhaps like we're supposed to be as we get to the end of the Beatitudes, perhaps people would recognize us more as salt and light to the world around us. Okay, I'm sorry, Okay, anyway. Like I said, eventually everybody followed his lead. Rudy just smiled and watched the little boy run toward home. He ran across home plate with a smile as big as Texas on his face. It was the first time he'd ever scored in his whole life, and he was so proud. His dad ran to him at home plate, and you should have seen their faces. The boy scored so much more than a run that day. It was a special moment in time for each and every one that was there. What a wonderful world it would be if we could all be as compassionate as Rudy and his teammates were that day. Rudy showed love to someone who opposed him. Remember, he's on the other team. And all too often we put our kids into situations where other kids are considered the enemy. The boy's willingness to let the opposition or the enemy run the bases inspired his teammates to do the same, and the lives of all those who were there that day were affected. My friends, no doubt we consider some folks, if not enemies, at least our opposition. At least that's the way we think of them. But you know what? In so very many ways, we're really all on the same team. But the team of broken humanity, where a little more love and compassion and mercy and grace can serve everyone better. It might even point them to Jesus. May we have the courage and the faith and the love to keep our eyes open for those kind of opportunities. And may God, not us, may God be glorified as we love our enemies. The challenge, be a peacemaker. Why? It's his way. Matthew 5:9, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Let's bow our heads and have a word of prayer.